Ah, there it goes. All right, anybody got anything from last week? Any questions or comments, concerns? Or from
2 weeks ago?
2 weeks ago?
Yeah.
Of course, since we canceled, the weather wasn't that bad at all. Dave was sending text messages back between everybody that was doing things on Wednesday, asking their opinions, and he wanted to keep it going, but then somebody mentioned that the schools were closed. They closed all their afternoon activities.
Yeah, they did.
So I sent him a text on the side. I said, I don't want to mess anything up, but so I sent him a side. I said, but the schools, all their activities are outdoors. It's football practice, things like that. All of ours are indoors, but just to be safe, we decided to cancel. And before I forget, next Wednesday, I won't be here next Wednesday. So you can talk amongst yourselves. So we'll go ahead and normally I try and ask Dave if he wants to do anything, or if anybody else wants to do anything on Wednesday, you can meet. But since he's out of town, I couldn't ask him. I forgot to ask him too far ahead of time. So if anybody else wants to cover, by all means, you can cover. I can give you a video or something you cover, or we can just cancel next week also and just pick up the week after. So right now we'll plan on just cancel for next week. It goes. We were supposed to go up to Tennessee, but there's a little bit of flooding up there, so we'll pass on that. Go up there another time. But all right. So if there's nothing else from 2 weeks ago, we finished up the textual criticism. So now we're gonna get into a little archaeology. So some of the physical evidence to show that the Bible's true and God's word is true. The first video I want to show you basically sets up the archaeology information, because it talks. I forget what this lady's name is. But she talks about how they go about dating things and stuff like that. So it kind of gives you an idea of how they do things, what they're looking for. So then the other videos we'll watch, they make a little bit more sense because you know the process is taking place. So we'll watch that first. Let me see if I can get it going.
When I say historical science, I like to swap that word, historical, with interpretation. What is a worldview? It's the lenses through which you view the world around you. And the Bible is confirmed by archaeology, and we see that in the archaeological record. Worldviews have consequences. Archaeology is destructive. If you think about it, you're exposing history, and you have to remove it from its context to then study more history. So let's start with some definitions. What is archaeology? Well, archaeology is the study of ancient mankind, their civilizations, remains, and artifacts. I want you to think of it this way. We have anthropology like an umbrella, which studies mankind in general, and we have archaeology underneath as a subcategory that focuses on ancient man in particular. Now, both anthropology and archaeology are fields of science. And if you've been through a museum, you've probably come across that there are two types of science that we like to refer to. There's something called observational science, which means it is observable, testable, and repeatable. I like to think of laboratory sciences where you create a hypothesis, conduct an experiment, and then you can then adjust your hypothesis and then reconduct the experiment. And you're in a lot of control, and you can observe what's actually occurring in front of you in real time. This is what we call observational science. Then there's something called historical science, which deals with origins, something you were not there to see when it originally happened. Now, I have a question for you, though. If you're paying attention to my definition, this picture on the right here, is this an example of archaeology? Yes or no? Shout it out. Yes. No. Why? Let's think about it. Let's talk this through. This is an example of paleontology. Remember I said it has to be ancient man, related in some way, right? So this is a fossilized fish. So this would be a paleontologist would be dealing with something like this. Now, what about this picture? Is this archaeology? Yes. Absolutely. It can be a building, it can be a road, it can be pottery, it can be bones. Now, if I find fish bones that humans have eaten, that's archaeology too. You see the connection there? So don't get an archaeologist and a paleontologist confused. We're not quite the same. Sometimes our fields overlap in certain things, but in general we're very different and we deal with different things. So good job, there's a clarification there. But why does archaeology and even paleontology fall under historical science? Well, it's because none of us were there when the fish was fossilized or when the humans used these vessels that they made. For example, these vessels here on the table, we dig them up, and these happen to be complete. This one's from the time of Abraham, and this one over here is from the time of Christ, the cooking pot. And we can look at them and make observations, but then you might sit here and go, well, why do they have these little holes in the handles? Their fingers don't fit in those. We don't know how they used them in particular, but we can, make educated guesses. Maybe they looped rope through it and they hung it on something. So we have to interpret what we find because none of us were there at that time when they used them to actually know 100% for sure what they used them for, and even the traditions that are associated with it. So it would fall under historical science. Now I'm going to give you a little example. I'm going to need your help. You're going to shout it out yes or no. I'm going to put a picture up there, and you're going to think critically and work through if you think observational or historical science is happening. You ready? Are these men practicing observational or historical science? Shout it out. Ooh, very good, very good. Sometimes I hear historical, it can get a little confusing. So let's talk through this. You might think, well, they're observing the skeleton with their eyes. Observational science, right? That's what you're thinking. Question, brownie points. Does anybody know whose skeleton this is? Oh, Lucy, you get all the brownies, sir. Good job, good job. Yes, this is Lucy's skeleton. And while it might be confusing to say, well, they're observing it with their eyes, therefore it's observational science, you all were correct and you picked up at, no, they're actually practicing historical science. Why? Because if you see in their thought bubbles, they're interpreting what they see in front of them. And the man on the left says, oh, this was an ancient, maybe bipedal primate-like creature that might be related to humankind in some form or fashion on our ancestral tree. And the man on the right goes, nope, it's just an ancient primate. That's all it is. Those are very different conclusions to the same skeleton that's laying there in front of them. Why does this happen? Well, if you've also been to our museum, you've probably come across this term. It's because of a worldview. What is a worldview? It's the lenses through which you view the world around you. And as most of us have to do, we have to wear glasses or even contact lenses to be able to even see. A worldview is very similar, where it allows you to see the world around you, and then it helps you interact with your world. And just so you know, worldviews have consequences. If you think about your glasses, if you don't wear your glasses or you have the wrong prescription on, you will bump into things and you will not be able to read your text messages and probably respond poorly, right? Well, a worldview is very similar. Depending on your worldview, it affects how you view the world, and it also affects how you behave, how you treat your neighbor, and how you look to the future. And there are two forms of worldview that we generally assign. One is based on man's word, and in particular dealing with humankind. This means you believe the world evolved over random chance processes, over naturalistic means, and that we evolved from some ape-like creature ancestor along the way. And if you believe that we are nothing more than animals, and there's nothing special, and that there are different races and there are different groups, then you will treat people differently, and you will believe in race, and then it will have consequences for how you live out your life and how you treat your neighbor. And we've seen this played out in history, and we'll touch on that more later on. But if you believe in God's word, and it is your foundation and your worldview, you know that you are made fearfully and wonderfully in the image of God, with innate value and worth, and that also changes how you treat your neighbor, or should, and how you live out your future as well. I'm going to give you another example here. We're going to practice critical thinking again. So remember how I said you have historical and observational science. Well, when I say historical science, I like to swap that word, historical, with interpretation. Does everybody see why I'd swap that out? So I'm going to put up a picture, and we're going to sort through fact and interpretation. You ready? Here we have the skull of Paranthropus robustus. Para means beside or near, and anthropos means man. So can somebody shout out, what do we know about this skull, this picture? What is the fact? Just shout it out. Someone said before, just to help along, it was my favorite observation anyone's ever made, it's dead. And I go, yes! Sometimes the obvious is easy to miss. Okay, so it's dead. Anything else? It's old, maybe, yeah?
Really big jaw.
It has a big jaw. It's partial, its pieces missing, it's broken. It has teeth. It had eyes at some point. Probably had some sort of snoot or nose going on, right? Well, the skull itself is the fact. We have it, we can see it, we can study it, we can measure the cranial capacity for the brain volume of the skull, of the actual brain case. We can look at maybe the enamel of the teeth and see maybe the wear patterns and help us determine maybe what it ate when it was alive. So the skull is a fact. We have it, we can study it, do tests on it. What is interpretation in this picture? It's not human. Very good. The name, beside or near man. The individual who found this skull determined it was probably an ancient cousin related to the line of humankind and its evolutionary process. And this is actually the interpretation that we align with from a biblical perspective, is this is actually a primitive ape skull. It's not human related. But the other piece of information that you don't see, but it's often presented as fact, is the age. 2 million years old, just so you know. Fossils don't come with tags on them in the ground. Sometimes, though, it's presented like that. Oh, this is a skull of Paranthropus robustus, and it's 2 million years old. And you go, well, I can't argue with that. No, that's interpretation. They date the fossils based on the layers of rock they find them in different testings that they can do with radiometrically. So if you believe the layers that they are found in are millions of years old, you will also believe that the fossils contained therein are millions of years old, and that's how they do that. But we know that this particular interpretation of the skull is not based on a biblical worldview. Biblically, we are told in Genesis 1, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. When we're studying archaeology, we want to know the answer to 3 questions. Who is man? Why is he here? And what has he done? We just want to know these things, because we as humans, we care. And we're told in Genesis of who we are. We're created beings made in the image of God with innate value and worth. Why are we here? To have dominion on the earth and to subdue it. But we're told also in the Gospels we're to take the gospel of the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ to the ends of the earth as well. What have we done? By the sin of Adam, the whole earth is broken and we're separated from God. But thanks be to God for his Son, Jesus Christ, who died for us that we might have hope and a future with him. And so you see, God's word, even just starting from the book of Genesis, it is our foundation. It is what we must base every area of our thinking on, especially when it deals with human origins, because it answers those things that we so hope to find, and we want to know the answers too. Now, who here has read the book of Job before? It's a bit of a downer sometimes, right? You might read it and get a little depressed. I used to actually not like reading it because I read it go, I don't really want to think about that, But the older I get and the more, pain and struggle you go through, you actually learn to relate to Job a lot. And he asks amazing questions about, what about pain? What about suffering? Did I deserve this? How do I relate to God? How does God relate to me? And one of the things I love that Job teaches us is about creation and God. Job tells us this, "But ask the beasts and they will teach you, the birds of the heavens and they will tell you, or the bushes of the earth and they will teach you, and the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? And his hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind." I love this passage because he's telling us that no matter where you look, it all points back to the Creator who made it. It's like his fingerprint and his design throughout everything we see. And science is the study of nature. And so all of these different fields of science, they all point back to and confirm the Word of God. But sadly, you probably don't hear about this a lot. You probably hear things like the Bible's not historically accurate, that person didn't exist, there's no evidence for this event, that place, that time. And I want to encourage you today that this is simply not true. And the Bible is confirmed by archaeology, and we see that in the archaeological record, and so I hope you'll be encouraged by the end of our talk. If I also had to guess, though, you've probably heard of archaeology in some way, you're familiar. Does anybody know this guy? Good old Indiana Jones. I grew up watching these, and who doesn't want to get into fist fights and walk off dramatically with explosions behind you? That's just cool. Who doesn't want to be an archaeologist? And then I get to university, and I go, wow, this is not glamorous at all. And archaeology is hard work, and you're oftentimes just moving dirt and stones. You're not even finding amazing things. And it's a lot of, note-keeping, attention to detail, and all these things. And all my professors in university, they despised Indiana Jones. And I was like, but they knew who he was, just as a side mention. And I said, why? Why do you have this problem with Indiana Jones? They go, because he's not an archaeologist. I go, what do you mean? He's a doctor of archaeology. And I said, he's never done archaeology in any of those films. He's a treasure hunter. And I go, the line is very fine between those things. I'm just saying, you walk very carefully. And while they are correct, we don't want to get our archaeological method from Indiana. After all, we don't want to remove idols and cause whole complexes to collapse. This is not good method. We can learn some things from these films. For example, archaeology is destructive. If you think about it, you're exposing history and you have to remove it from its context to then study more history and you get further down in the archaeological record. And if you don't have proper method and training and note-keeping, that can be lost for future generations forever, and that has happened. where we've lost it, and now our children will never know what we found. And so it's very important that you're properly trained, and I think this is one thing we might be able to take away from these movies. Something else that I think we can take away from these films is the play and the conflict between worldview. Does anybody know this scene? This is my favorite fight scene, by the way, just so you know. Indiana is in constant conflict with the Nazi Germans in these movies because the Nazi Germans want to control and utilize the artifacts and the magical powers they think they have for their own regime and their own propaganda. And Indiana's trying not to let that happen. And while, this is a funny fight scene and, the movies are interesting and intriguing, and we might think, oh, that's just Hollywood, no, that's not the case. We've seen throughout history science used as a weapon against humanity, and in particular during the Holocaust, when we were told that it's perfectly fine to exterminate whole people groups because we're nothing more than ape-like creatures anyway, and survival of the fittest. We need to create the Aryan race, and this is our goal, according to Nazi propaganda. And Adolf Hitler based his worldview on a naturalistic perspective. And you might think, well, that's extreme. It's not extreme. He was living out his worldview consistently. He was living it out. And this is the consequence of that worldview. Because, like I mentioned, if we're nothing more than ape-like creatures, it's survival of the fittest. And if I'm stronger, I can kill you without batting an eye. You're in my way. But if you believe we're made fearfully and wonderfully in the image of God, and we're all one race, and that's Adam's race, then Christ's blood covers you and me, and we're equal, and it makes you live out your life completely differently. Should. And so we see consequences of these worldviews. I think this is something that's interesting that we see actually playing out in even these movies. Has anybody ever heard any of these terms that are naturalistically based in archaeology? Has anybody ever heard of these? Just so you know, BCE, CE, it means before Common Era and Common Era. It was used to replace Year of Our Lord and Before Christ, because those are religious terms and it made people uncomfortable using Christ as a chronological marker. Even though he's the most significant individual to ever walk the face of the earth, they wanted to remove him from that, so they used BCE and CE. And just to be clear, I often have to use these terms because archaeologists will not know what I'm talking about, especially secular ones, if I just say, make up my own. So you have to use what you have, but something that I do is I define my terms. And I say, this is what I mean. When I say the word caveman, I don't mean an ape man that lived in a cave. I mean a man who lived in a cave. You see, when you read these words or you're speaking with someone and they use any of these terms, ask them what they mean. What do you mean by caveman? What do you mean prehistoric? Is that when you mean like when men were evolving into apes, or is that just before the creation of writing? You see, there's a difference. You have to actually define your terms. So how do we create these terms? How do we get things like Bronze Age, Stone Age, Iron Age? What does that even mean? Well, let's talk about cake. I love cake. Anybody here like cake? Chocolate? Very good. So in this picture here, we have what we call strata, or stratigraphy, and that just means layers. So when you're going to make a cake to eat, you're going to put the first layer of cake down, then some icing, then another layer, so on. Then you're going to cut a slice and pull it out, and you see all these beautiful layers you've made. Those are called strata. And if you think about this, the lowest layer is the one you put down first, right? That's the oldest layer. The newest layer is on top. So when we're looking at these geological layers, or these earthen layers here, the oldest ones are on the bottom. That's how we do it. And these are what we would call flood layers. And that means they were laid down in the flood of Noah's day. And we read about this flood in Genesis chapter 7, where all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm the earth, and all mankind. They all died. And this is where you're going to get most of your paleontology and geology here. That was laid down in the flood. Just so you are aware, we cannot get into the discussion today about how they date these layers, how they date fossils, but what you need to know is in the secular world, in secular archaeology, human history starts here. They do not consider this human history because we're not human yet. Okay, everybody see that? This is all the evolutionary process, and then humans start appearing in history here. So according to the naturalistic perspective, archaeological layers begin here, and then we start getting terms like this that pop up. Has anybody ever heard of these? Yes. Well, as archaeologists were digging down in these layers, and these are just those layers blown up to show the ages, the dates associated. These are secular timelines. This is what you'd find in most textbooks. As archaeologists were digging down in these strata, they said, oh, there's a lot of iron tools. Okay, there's less iron, but now there's more bronze. Okay, less bronze, but now there's more stone and bone tools. If we take these layers and we turn it into a timeline, Their interpretation is, as mankind evolved, so did his technology. And while we would agree that mankind does change in how we live with technology, I mean, who here remembers what cell phones were like 30 years ago, or computers that filled whole rooms and now fit in your pocket, right? We don't disagree. Technology does develop. It would be silly not to agree with that. And we also agree that civilization and culture and tradition change with technology that does develop. It changes how we spend time with family, the different traditions we do in our household, how we cook meals, all these different things that technology changes. And so while we do agree that yes, technology changes and human culture does with it, we do not agree that we were ape men that came across it and then became more human along the way. This is a difference of seeing who's using the technology at that time. And so often we would say, no, that was a human, perfectly normal human that was using that tool, not an ape man, not this gentleman that you see on the picture here. We're also told that you see here we have these beautiful little boxes on the side, right? Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, very neat and tidy. And science in general, we like our boxes. Don't mess with my box. Everything fits perfectly in my box. And then we're told things like this in the Bible. Zillah also bore Tubal-Cain, and he was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. Just so you know, Tubal-Cain lives 7 generations from Adam, not that long after Adam was created, and he's before the flood, and we're told that he used bronze and iron. So what does this mean? We have Bronze Age, Iron Age. How do we understand this from a biblical perspective? Because biblically, that does not agree with what archaeologists have assigned different periods. And that could be a little discouraging. What does that mean? Well, what we find are these things called anomalies, which don't quite fit where we want them to in archaeology, and they're my favorite because they remind us we don't know everything. And I love it. So let's look at some of these. If you see on the left, the Iron Age is said to begin around 1,200 years before Christ. Everybody see that on the left? And then what do we find? These iron beads that pop up in Er Gerizeh and Lower Egypt, and they date to 3,500 years before Christ. You just heard a lot of numbers. Let me point this out. So, 1,200, 3,500. They found these beads that date to the beginning of the Bronze Age, and they're made of iron. That doesn't make sense. Why would they find that? That doesn't connect archaeologically with what we know. So secular archaeologists would say, okay, a meteorite hit the earth, humans found it, because meteorites are sometimes pure iron. They find it, they use it to make beads, voila. And I go, hold on, just a second. Maybe a meteorite did, happens. How did they know how to create these delicate, finely crafted beads? Not to mention, beads, most of us in here are wearing some sort of jewelry, right? Or earrings or something. Jewelry and earrings and these things, they reflect beauty, culture, a connection to decorating, which reflect human attributes. That's something we do. Maybe a woman wore these. Maybe it was part of a religious ceremony. We don't quite know, but all we know is it reflects something deeper than just a lump of metal they put on someone's neck. And so they can't quite explain why this happens and why it shows up in the archaeological record, but these aren't the only iron artifacts that show up far earlier than what we call the Iron Age. And this should be encouraging, because we would expect, after the flood with Noah and his 3 sons, as they expanded out, that certain individuals had the skills to use these raw materials as they found them and as they were able to utilize them to create these things. And we see that in archaeology. And that's really cool. So how do we understand this timeline, biblically speaking? Well, here I have a biblical timeline. And remember, we have to use these terms and these periods, otherwise people have no idea what we're talking about. But I don't know about you, for me, it helps to associate a person or an individual from the Bible with it, because then I can envision the event that occurred. So if I said Bronze Age, you could think patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, And just to point this out, when we look at our biblical timeline here, these layers are where you're going to find the foundational differences in secular archaeology. Why? Remember, these are the flood layers, and these are what we call Stone Age layers, and they date these to millions of years old. Does everybody follow that? So this is where the major differences are going to be in your archaeology when you're dealing with biblical and secular. Once you get past those layers, they tend to kind of mirror each other a lot more, and they reflect each other more. So how do we date things once we get past these layers? We use something called carbon-14 dating a lot. Has anybody ever heard of this? So let's talk about it. What is it? How do we use it? What are some of the drawbacks? Well, carbon-14 begins in the atmosphere from cosmic rays, and it gets absorbed into living things. Like, for example, we eat plants, we eat animals, animals eat plants, and we breathe air, all these different things. We are living, breathing, eating creatures, and we absorb C14. For example, we have this little clump of grass, and he's just chilling here, right? He's just chilling. He's full of C14. And then this adorable cow comes along, and he starts eating this grass, and he's absorbing all this C14. Just so you know as well, every living person, remember, has C14 in them, and hopefully that's everybody in here is living, right? You all have C14 in you, and the ratio of C14 inside you is equal to that in the atmosphere outside of you, because you're alive and you're living, breathing, you've equalized. You're in equilibrium there. And as all living things must do, they die. It's kind of funny, it's fine, you can laugh too, it's fine. So upon death, carbon intake stops, okay? And the cow's not living, eating, breathing, nothing. So it begins to decompose. And scientists have given the rate at which C14 decomposes a number, and that's called its half-life. Does everybody remember this term from chemistry years ago? It gives them traumatic memories. Yes. So the half-life for carbon-14, for half of the atoms to break down, has been estimated to be around 5,730 years. So let's look at this. We have the bone from our cow up top, and it's full of carbon-14 atoms. 5,730 years passed, now half is left. 5,730 years passed, now half of that half is left. You see how it's broken by half every single time? Someone should stop me and say, how do we know the rate of decay is constant?
I don't know the rate of decay is constant.
Thank you. I can answer that question. We don't. We don't. And that's an assumption that's built into the carbon-14 dating method, is that the individual who created this method believed the Earth was millions of years old, and if that's the case, things have stabilized over millions of years, so the rate of decay would be constant by now. And what we're finding with other scientific tests that we've done is that there are certain contributors to the environment that can speed up the rate of decay and that can slow it down. And then another assumption you have to also build in is, who here knows how much carbon-14 dating it started with? Nobody knows. I wasn't there when that cow died, nobody knows. So what do we need for carbon-14 dating to 100% work? We need to know the starting amount of C14, we need to know the current amount of C14 in a sample, and we need to know the half-life. It's a math equation, if you're picking up on it. It's a math equation. So the half-life, we have a number built on an assumption, we know that, but we have something to plug in and start with. You have to start somewhere. So we have something to work with. The current amount of C14, we can measure that in a sample in the lab. It's right there in front of us. As I mentioned, who was there when the cow died to measure the carbon-14 in the atmosphere to conduct the whole experiment and complete the equation? Nobody was. So there's missing information here that inhibits us from actually completing the actual analysis. So in archaeology, we do something called calibrate. We calibrate our carbon-14 dating, and how you calibrate, it depends on your starting anchor points of different dates. And I won't get into it, it gets complicated. But scientists, if anybody tells you carbon-14 dating is 100% accurate, you need to get up from that conversation and leave, because secular and biblical agree it is not 100% accurate and it needs a lot of work done on it. And so just think of it this way. We have this beautiful hourglass here. Who's a victim? Volunteer. What's your name?
Me?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, Darla.
Miss Darla. You're in an alleyway, I don't know why, but you're there temporarily, okay? And you come across this hourglass, and the upper glass is broken and the sand's gone from the upper portion. And I say, Miss Darla, can you tell me how much time this measured originally? You would take some time to think about it if I gave you time, and you'd say, I can measure the sand in the bottom. Get that? I can measure maybe the rate at which it falls, but I don't know how much sand or time it held originally, because I wasn't there when it was broken. But if I was there and when it was broken, and I said, it measured an hour, then you would do your equation. You say, I can even tell you what time it stopped, because I could see how much time passed and the rate at which it passed. Carbon-14 dating is very similar, where we're missing the original starting amount of sand, for example. And so you have, like, this could hold only enough time for 30 minutes. You don't know. We have minute hourglass. We still call them an hourglass. I don't know why. But we have like little minute glasses, right? So it depends. And I would recommend we maybe go to the person who was there when the hourglass was complete, God, who tells us how much time was there originally, who starts history with us. I think that's very important. And so think critically whenever you read about a carbon-14 date and how they arrive at it, because it's only as useful as the information you plug into it for your equation, how they get that information, and even the calibration curve they use. Depends on a lot of worldview playing there. So just be critical when you think about that and you come across that. Now, something else we use in archaeology is pottery. We use pottery to date things as well. And if we're blessed, we'll find complete vessels like these up front, which are all authentic and they're from Israel, so come up and see them for sure. But we usually find pieces like this, which are broken in the picture. And just so you're aware, they're often small. This is a nice large storage jar handle. They're often that big, and you have to wash every single piece when you're in the field. And you end up not wanting to find pottery anymore. You're like, we didn't see that piece, you know. And so what happens is we take the pottery and we look at it and we go, oh, we find a rim, a piece of the rim here, or the handle, and we say, oh, that's typical of this style of, let's say, the Israelites made styles of pottery in this way. And so if I find this jar handle in the ground, I can say, oh, maybe Israelites lived here. You kind of see the connection there. Or I find a piece that has painting artwork on it, and it's typical of Philistine wear, Philistine artwork. And I say, oh, maybe Philistines lived here, or people who liked Philistine pottery. So then it helps us build and interpret who lived at that site, how long they were at that site, and how it developed. And if you're blessed like I was to get a first complete vessel on my first dig, this is pretty cool. My square partner who was digging with me, who's a classmate, he looks over and he goes, I've been digging for 7 years. And I've not found a single thing. And the first thing you find in my first square, I think it was like the second day, is a complete vessel. He goes, I'll take your picture, it's fine. But then later on, he found something that was super cool, like 2 feet from me, and he was ecstatic. And I just looked over and I said, you know why you found that? It's because I'm here. And he goes, whatever, and I took his picture. So we were even, so we were good. But what's cool about vessels like this and the complete ones on the table is you can do something called residue analysis on the inside. You can see maybe what they were drinking. So for mine, no, I don't know the results yet, just so you know. If it was used for wine, maybe a decanter of some sort, we could see maybe if they used any spices in their wine. And would that connect them with trade routes during that time? You see how it kind of builds on itself culturally? It's really fascinating. So how do we connect stratigraphy, layers, pottery, and carbon-14 dating to make a timeline and interpret a site? Well, you're going to help me with this. It's not going to be hard, I promise. It'll be fun. Mm-hmm. So on the bottommost layer, we have what we call an oil lamp on the bottom. And in this layer, with this lamp, we find a burned olive pit. Now, this burned olive pit it's organic material, used to be alive. So we send that off to the lab for carbon-14 dating. And just so you are aware, if you're in the field and you wrap up your sample and you send it off to the lab, when they give you back your results, they do not give you one date. They give you a range of dates. It can range from 30 to even a couple hundred years. It depends on your calibration and what information you're really looking for. And so that's why you have the same carbon-14 dates, that 2 archaeologists who disagree can use the same information because they pick the date that best fits their interpretation. Just so you're aware, that's how that works. And so you get back a date range for this olive pit of the Bronze Age, think Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this period. And so then what this would tell us, and this is also hyper-simplified, just so you know, because it gets complicated, but what this would tell us is, okay, this layer contains this olive pit that dates to this time. Therefore, most likely, the pottery found in this layer would date to being used in this time. So everybody follow that. So then if I find this lamp at another site, but I don't have an olive pit, then I can say, well, that's a Bronze Age lamp, and most likely that layer at that site is also Bronze Age. Do you see that connection? So then the olive pit then helps date the pottery, which then helps dates the layer, which then helps date the site. And you also kind of get how it's a little circular reasoning too. Kind of catch on to that? Yeah, that's just how it works. That's how we do it. But it's interesting, and it's kind of fascinating because it all builds on top of each other. Now, something else that we do is we can date things like textile or cloth because it's made of organic material. In this case, it's probably flax. And it comes back with a date of around the late bronze, think Samson, Gideon. And so then that helps date that layer and things found in that layer to that period. Then we have what we call the knife-paired Roman lamp. And what period do you think that is? Knife-paired Roman lamp. Roman? Very good. Amazing. Good job. This is an authentic one here from a time of the Roman period, but it dates to usage probably around 100 BC to 100 AD. So think time of Jesus when these lamps were used. And they're so common of this period that we call them knife-paired Roman lamps, put the name Roman in it, and we also call them Herodian lamps, and that also narrows down the time. So when you find this lamp, you know you're in the Roman period. You just know, because it becomes another dating method because it's so common. And then lastly, we have what we call a slipper lamp up top, which is typical of the late Roman, early Byzantine period. Think Emperor Constantine. So now it's your turn. You ready? I'm going to put up an artifact, and you're going to shout out what period you think it dates to. Here we go. What period does this date to? Shout it out. You got this. Roman. Jesus. Very good. Yes. It's wonderful. What about this one? Late bronze. Excellent. Excellent job. Very good. Late bronze. Now, can somebody tell me, for brownie points, what's different about this artifact that none of the rest of them have? Carvings. Anybody know what type? Ooh, who said that? Okay. Triple brownies. You said hieroglyphs. What culture is that from? I heard an echo. Okay, I should have made more brownies. You guys are doing amazing. Good job. So this is Egyptian. This is from Egypt. Hieroglyphs. This is called a scarab. A scarab means beetle. And this is a massive replica of one where you'd have a beetle on one side, and then on the other side you'd have an inscription. And typically what you would do is you take your scarab. This one's the size of like a ring. It fits on a ring. And you would write a letter, put a piece of clay on it, and then you'd stamp it with that scarab, and it would typically hold your name on it. And so this scarab in particular holds the name of Pharaoh Seti I. And if I said Pharaoh and Egypt and hieroglyphs, you're probably thinking, well, it was probably found in Egypt. It wasn't actually. It was found in Canaan, in the land of Israel, in particular the Jezreel Valley, which is further north of Israel. And why is this important? Why is this a big deal? Well, it gets exciting because we joke around that we don't find things like Joey was here. We just don't find that. But we do find names sometimes, and we get super excited. So this tells us that Pharaoh Seti I and his influence reached up into the land of Canaan, particularly in Israel, and it was found in a burial with a male's bones. Now, it was not buried with Pharaoh. It was probably an administrator of his that carried his authority with him into the land of Canaan. And then what's cool is then we can connect this period of history in Egypt with this period of history in Israel and Canaan as well, and they can hold hands temporarily. And that's really fascinating, and that's why one of the reasons why I love names. Now, let's talk about a couple other really cool names we find. We're now going to move to the northernmost point of the modern state of Israel. It's called a site, Tel Dan is what it's called, and in this site they find what we call an Israelite gate complex right here. And in this location they uncovered what's called the Tel Dan inscription, and this is the first extra-biblical mention of David. Why is this a big deal? Because archaeologists, up until this point, when they found this inscription, believed that David was not a real person. He was a King Arthur made up by later periods to give them claim to the throne, establish a dynasty, kind of this idea. And then they find this inscription, which is written in ancient Aramaic, and it dates to the 9th century. And it mentions two kings. It mentions a king Joram, and it mentions a king named Ahaziah. Now we read about these two kings by name in the book of 2 Kings chapter 8, and they're at war with the king of Aram Damascus called Hazael, who lives up north from them, and he's a real pain in their side. And what we find is that both of these kings actually, Joram and Ahaziah, get overthrown by someone from the inside, not actually by Hazael. But what's fascinating is that we believe King Hazael commissioned this inscription. And what's fascinating is that he takes credit for killing these two kings. Kings take credit for things they don't do all the time, just so you know. But what's cool is he mentions that I killed Joram. And then he says, and I killed Ahaziah, who's king of the house of David. And then I go, wow, why would a foreign king mention the dynasty of a man who didn't exist? He's only 100 years after him. It's not that long. After all, this man wants to take credit for destroying this dynasty. It's a big deal to him. Well, it's ironic as in taking credit for destroying something which he actually didn't do. He actually preserved it for all of us in the future. I found that kind of ironic. And so now archaeologists say, okay, David was a real person, but he wasn't as big a deal as we think he is. Question, just so you can think through this. If David wasn't real, who's Jesus? He's from the line of David. So there are a lot of Christians when archaeologists are saying David wasn't real, I'm just like, it doesn't really affect me. I don't have to care about it because you can believe he wasn't real. It doesn't really matter to me. Yes, it does, because he is the forebearer of Jesus Christ. It comes through his line, his lineage. So it's important that you do know about these questions and accusations about the biblical text, that you can confront them with the truth. Because we knew about David before they ever found him in archaeology, because the Bible mentioned him first. And we're finding that oftentimes archaeology is catching up with the Bible, not the reverse. So let's look at something else, which is quite fascinating. We're going to move now to the Central Hill Country, to a site called, which you're probably very familiar with, it's called Jerusalem. It's kind of a big deal. And in Jerusalem, where I did my studies, there's an area called the Gavadi parking lot, which was a parking lot they dug underneath in this location, and they uncovered multiple administrative buildings. So here's a picture of the site. It's like a state park now, and they have it all roped off like this. You can walk around the perimeter. And what they found in one of these buildings was a couple bullae. Now, what are bullae? Well, a bulla is a clay seal impression. If remember, you have your scarab. It leaves an impression on something. That something is the clay seal on the top. And so they found oftentimes only the clay seal is preserved because it's made of clay and it hardens into like a pottery almost. And so one of these seals that they found reads, L'Natan Melech Avodah Melech, to Nathan Melech, servant of the king. Who here, when they read biblical names, kind of glaze over, or genealogies, and you go, who'd name their kid that? I don't know why. Well, let me remind you, they are hard and they can get confusing, but God wouldn't have preserved it if it wasn't for a purpose. And it's there for us. And so what do we find? What was happening in Jerusalem during the 7th century, which this bulla dates to, in this location, and who's this Nathan Melech guy? Well, we read about this man in 2 Kings 23, because we read that King Josiah was reigning during this time, and he was enacting religious reform, and he was tearing down the horses the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun at the entrance to the house of the Lord by the chamber of Nathan Melech the chamberlain, who would be living in this location during this time for these events. So archaeologists say, okay, the name is similar, and it preserves the fact that this name was used during that time. And they are correct. We cannot jump to the conclusion and say this is the exact same person, because we just can't do that. But I would say that it is logical to follow if this person's name was used during this time, and we didn't even know that until recently from the bulla, the Bible preserved that originally. That probably means the Bible was written by an eyewitness who lived during that time and knew these names were being used in this location at that time. Okay? So would that not lead you to believe that this person lived in this place during that time for these events? Probably. So let's look at another site. Now we're going to move to what we call the House of Bullae. What do you think they found there? A lot of bullae, over 51 of these things. And let's look at a couple other two major players in the account of Josiah the king, who's my favorite king, by the way. So Josiah sends Hilkiah the high priest to the temple to clean it out and restore it back to worship the one true God. And while Hilkiah is there, he finds the lost book of the law and gives it to Shaphan the secretary, who takes it to the king and reads it, and the story progresses from there. Now, what's fascinating is most biblical scholars and archaeologists will claim the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of Moses, were not written until the time of Josiah or shortly after him. Think critically here. How can you have a lost book of the law unless it's written earlier? It has to be written earlier before it can be lost, right? So the Bible does not agree with how itself was recorded in its own testimony. So we need to look at that critically. So if archaeologists and biblical scholars are claiming that, the Bible itself does not agree with that. So let's see what we find. We read about this Hilkiah, the high priest, and he has a son named Azariah. Read about this in 1 Chronicles. Chronologies and genealogies are important. What do we find? The Azariahu ben Hilkiahu, belonging to Azariah, the son of Hilkiah, found in the location of the Temple Mount, where administrative center was, dated to this period, records these two names. Archaeologists say, can't be the same person. We can't make that statement. but the names are common during this time. And I go, okay, yeah, all right. But the Bible mentioned that first. Isn't that interesting? And then we read about Shaphan the secretary. And we read that Shaphan has a son named Gemariah. We read about him in Jeremiah 36. What do we find? The Gemariahu ben Shaphan, belonging to Gemariah, the son of Shaphan. Now this is the first one. The secular and biblical archaeologists say it's the same person because the name, that particular name, isn't as common. And so they say this has to be the same person that's mentioned. And I go, yes, success, we agree. You know, how fascinating is that? And you go, well, why does this matter? We have the names of these people recorded in this place during this time for the events that are all mentioned in the Bible. Someone there, an eyewitness, knew this, saw this, and wrote it down. So let's look at something else. We're now going to move over to the western valleys called the Hinnom Valley. Has anybody heard of Gehinnom or Gehenna? That's typically a term in the New Testament. It's used for hell or Hades, this kind of idea. And the reason why is it's a word, it's a term that's made up after the name of this valley because this is where the Israelites would burn their children to Molech, in this valley. And so they have a lot of tombs here. And these tombs in particular are dated to the time of David, Solomon. And if you see on the left, they have these little gingerbread cutouts shapes. That's where you'd lay the head of your loved one and their body would extend out. And then you would come back in a year or two. This is all in a cave-like process that's sealed up. And you would just have their bones left. And if you see my buddy Charles sitting here in his yellow shirt, you'd take their bones and you'd put them in this little alcove underneath to rest with their fathers. And that's where they would rest for all of eternity. And you would literally be mingled together with your forebears' bones. And in this alcove, which is about 8 to 9 feet deep, they uncovered one of the most amazing discoveries ever found. And they're called the Ketef Hinnom Scrolls, and they are the oldest quotation of biblical text ever found. And they date to the 7th, early 6th century, and they predate the Dead Sea Scrolls by 500 years. They're older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is really cool. They are written on silver, and they were rolled up. I do not want the job of unrolling these things, but somebody had that job. And they're fascinating because they are quotations of a passage from the book of Deuteronomy and a passage from the book of Numbers. 2 of the 5 books of Moses. That's interesting. So they would have been inscribed probably during the time of Josiah or shortly after him. And what I want to pose to you is this question. They had to get this inscription. They had to copy these from something. They got this written inscription, this written tradition from somewhere. So where'd they get it from? Maybe the lost book of the law that the Bible records? Interesting. So look at these beautiful, just the translation on the left is from the scroll itself, and the ESV version of our modern Bibles is on the right, and they just echo each other so beautifully, how the Lord's preserved his word, even from the 7th century BC. It's beautiful, and my favorite. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Aaronic blessing given to Aaron, the brother of Moses, who established the priesthood. And we see this in this scroll that they found, almost word for word. Why do I make a big deal about this? Because Jesus told us this. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? Jesus saw the Old Testament as historically accurate, real people, real places, real events. And it's upon this foundation that he built his ministry and why he's even here. And so it's important that you care about it too. And you understand how people don't agree with some of this being historically accurate. So then you can give them the truth and then show them how, especially if they're believers, you need to care about it because it affects who the Messiah is and his foundation that you build your faith upon. So it matters. And I hope that you're encouraged. Archaeology does confirm the Bible from what we've seen. And these aren't the only examples. I couldn't fit them all on a slide either. It's just too much. But this is encouraging because we need to hear about these. And I want to leave you on this note. So has anybody read the book of Daniel? Yes, one of my other favorite individuals, Daniel, amazing guy. He tells us this about our Creator. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. I love this passage because as an archaeologist, I'm literally digging in the darkness to expose it to the light, to just create some sort of understanding for the mess we usually find. And it's important also, even during this time of, even politically speaking, God's not up there wringing his hands going, what's going on? What am I going to do? He's never gotten off his throne. And he's still there. And he's the one that we go to where light dwells, and we can go to him for comfort and for hope in our future. And this should be encouraging. I want to compare this with Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king who reigned during the time of Daniel. And remember, he was arrogant and proud, and he shook his fist at God and was like, I've done all this for the glory of my might and for my majesty, and God humbled him. Well, Nebuchadnezzar said this at the end. No, I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. I use this as a reminder for me, because it's easy to take all this information and want to beat someone across the head with it, right? And say, why don't you get it? You know, all this is true. But just remember that it's easy to become prideful and say, I know all the answers. We don't have all the answers, but the answers we do have are found in God's word. And you point them to God's word through his love and his Savior, Jesus Christ, that he gave us. And you use that as your example. And then everything else just builds on top of it. So let's go to the one with whom light dwells first, because he sheds light on those deep and dark and hidden things. And I hope you're encouraged. Archaeology does confirm the Bible.
Let me see if I can get this going. I want to show you a couple of little things real quick. Anybody have any questions or comments on that while I'm looking this other stuff up real quick?
How old is this?
That presentation, I think that was about 6 months ago. Yeah. So let me show you. She was talking about, the different worldviews, man's worldview versus the biblical worldview. I kind of want to show you this video and how sometimes they like to force things into their worldview. When she was showing the skeleton of Lucy. Let's see if I can find it real quick. All right, so Lucy.
A tiny female collapses into an ancient lake.
Lucy, if anybody's been to the Creation Museum in Kentucky, they have a mock-up of the skeleton of Lucy, and they talk about all the different things and how scientists determined what it was. They believe it was one of the first humanoid type animals that walked upright or whatever. So, in most biblical scholars think it was just a monkey at the time. But what I want to show you is the difference in the worldviews and how people look at the same thing, because all they have is the bones. So they're looking at these bones and they're interpreting them different. But let me show you how sometimes they'll go to extremes to make changes in what they're looking at. So this, I took the PBS show Nova did a special on Lucy. I edited down just the parts I want to kind of show you real quick to show you what the gentleman who discovered it, the extremes he went through to get it to force it into his worldview. So let me show you this brief part here real quick. Let's see if I can see it.
A tiny female collapses into an ancient lake. She emerges 3 million years later, and a determined anthropologist finds her fossilized bones. Could she be the missing link between ape and us? For Don Johansson, she is the starting point of a tireless quest to understand our past. A Nova miniseries over 3 nights, In Search of Human Origins.
Lucy turned old predictions upside down. It was thought the missing link would be a smart ape that walked on all fours. Here was the skeleton of a creature that looked like it could walk like us, but with many ape-like features. The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea. We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the 2 parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together in later fossilization.
After Lucy died, some of her bones lying in the mud must have been crushed or broken, perhaps by animals browsing at the lakeshore.
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bone seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost. Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster. He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours. Anatomically, at least, Lucy could stand like a human. The case for our earliest ancestor walking upright was growing stronger.
So when you take power tools to it, yeah.
So why doesn't he have DNA samples?
To get DNA samples from that, I think you'd have to go into the bones, like the marrow and all that, to get that out of there. But you think about what they said. Now, Nova is not a Christian organization, so they had nothing in the game as far as trying to prove whether. They're just reporting what happened. So they say at the original that the bone resembled a chimpanzee, but then he went. So his theory is, think how far-fetched that is. That Lucy died, some animal crushed its bones, and then it just so happened to fuse together in the shape of a chimpanzee's hip bone. So then, but if you take power tools to it and grind it all down, then you can make it into a human, because that's the way it originally was. It's like, how does he know how it originally was? He wasn't there when they died. So sometimes they go to extremes to try and force something into their worldview rather than just accept it for what it is and look at it and be like, it's because a lot of these guys, they work for universities, and they want to be able to write these papers and be able to make a big name for themselves or whatnot, and make a name for the university. So they will force a lot of things in. And you'll see there's, if you ever see reports come out in like the news or magazines and it talks about the next human link that's been discovered, about 3 years ago, they discovered the next step in the human species, and they do the story. But then when you read the story, but then they don't anticipate people like me who decide to look, well, where's that report coming from? And they look at the report, and the last one that they did, it came from a single toe bone. So from one toe bone, they decided that, oh, this is a whole other human species. and then that human species was the next link from this other human, which in that case they had like 3 foot fragments, a shin bone, and I think a finger, which was found in a cave, like on another continent somewhere. And they link all these things together, but sometimes they go to really extremes to try and force a worldview in there, or they'll just jump in there. Like I said, for one, how do you know from a single toe bone what this whole human looked like, or what it's just. They'll show you the skulls and everything, and typically they'll never find a whole series of skulls that look the same. They'll find one skull that looks almost ape-like, and they'll say, oh, that's obviously some Neanderthal or whatever. But they never find a whole series of them. So if anybody's ever seen the old wrestling Andre the Giant, you look at his skull features, when somebody digs him up hundreds of years from now, they're going to say, oh, he was some Neanderthal. And then you pull up, you pull up for a lot of us in the room, you probably remember Billy Barty. He was in a lot of TV shows. I can't think of the Croft TV shows where he was a little person or whatever. So he's got a real small skull. If they dig him up, he's gonna be a whole other species or whatever. So it's crazy how they kind of do things. But there's some other. I'm just kind of going on showing you a couple of little minor things here as we go. Because the other thing I wanted to show is a little bit too long for today. So I'll show you. Let me show you one more. She's showing you that scroll that they had to unravel. Let me show you how if they can't unravel it, they can still read them. Let me find that. Let's see.
Seems like to me the scroll will break apart if they can get it unraveled.
Yeah, and they go through very meticulous procedures.
Silver, right?
That was silver, yeah. So this is the Engedi scroll. Let me kind of get it. Let me get it and pause it so I can put it on for everybody else.
Ritual unwrapping begins by
this. They couldn't unravel, so they had to do what they call virtual unraveling. Let's make sure it's going to.
Ritual unwrapping begins by acquiring a three-dimensional volumetric scan of the damaged manuscript. This scan produces a set of cross-sectional images that show the internal structure of the scroll. When viewed as a 3D object, one can clearly see the individual layers of the scroll, but any text on the surface of those layers is obscured from view. In order for a readable version of the scroll to be produced, these images must be passed through our virtual unwrapping pipeline. First, we capture the 3D shape of the layers of the scroll in a process called segmentation. On the left side of the screen, the software moves through the scroll, image by image, tracing the shape of a single scroll wrap. On the right, we see the 3D model that this produces. Next, we extract the ink from the data in a process called texturing. Using the 3D shape generated by segmentation, our software makes another pass through the scroll, this time looking for very bright pixels. Bright pixels indicate regions of dense material, in this case, inks made with iron or lead. We now have a single wrap of the scroll with the text shown clearly on its surface. However, because the surface is curved, it's difficult to read all of the text from one viewpoint. The flattening stage of our pipeline converts this textured 3D surface into a flat plane so that the text can be more easily read. To produce the best results, these 3 steps must be performed on one small section of the scroll at a time. As a result, we end up with several texture images that must be merged together. This merging process creates a single consolidated image that shows the full text. Using this pipeline, we have restored and revealed the text of 5 complete wraps of the Engedi scroll. The 2 distinct columns of Hebrew writing reveal the scroll to be the book of Leviticus. This marks the Engedi scroll as the earliest copy of a Pentateuchal book ever found in a holy ark, a significant discovery in biblical archaeology.
Basically CT scans for that, and they just go layer by layer, deeper and deeper, and then so it's kind of fascinating to see how they can do some of that stuff because that one couldn't physically be unrolled, so they had to go through and just do those scans and go through, and they'll do the aluminum, the silver one. I imagine they couldn't do that because it's metal, but before they even attempt to unroll a lot of this stuff, a lot of scrolls and things now, they're doing similar things. That way they can have it before they start trying to unroll it. If they can't unroll it without it getting damaged, then they'll just leave it like this. That's still like that. But it's kind of fascinating to see how they can go through and find this stuff now too. But so any other questions or comments on what we got? We're ending like super early today. Next, like I said, next week we won't be here because I'll be out of town. But then I want to go the following week. I want to show you a video called Genesis History. And that basically goes through a lot of stuff in the book of Genesis and showing how Genesis is true and a lot of things line up with that. And they also talk about man's view and biblical worldview also as they compare both of those. So anything? Like
Have you seen the one recently?
Yeah, I'm sure you've seen it. Yeah,
probably. It was, if it's the one I'm thinking of, it was really good.
Yeah, I enjoy it. So, any other questions, comments, or?
Are these the ones you did previously where?
Yeah, a lot of them are the same videos from before. Yeah, I think I've added a few more in, but the bulk could be similar to what we played last year as well. As I find more stuff, I try and add it in to to help basically show you more and more evidence, because the more every year they're finding more and more stuff. Of course, I try and find some that are entertaining. There's a gentleman by the name of his last name's Kennedy, Dr. Kennedy. He's an archaeologist. He's doing finding a lot of stuff now. Found a lot of really cool stuff. He's written a couple of really good books, but his interviews are terrible. He is so robotic. He stares at the camera and talks so monotone. And it's like, I have a couple of his videos, but they're hard to watch, so I won't play his stuff as he goes through. But there's a couple of really good guys out there. What's the name of the guy you guys watch all the time? I can't think of his name. I got several of his videos because he does a really good job of putting presentations together. Yeah, I'll have to find them. You'll recognize them when I play them, because I know you guys seen a bunch of them. Your dad tells me about them all the time. All right, well, there's nothing further. We'll go ahead and close this, and then we'll see you in a couple weeks. Dear Heavenly Father, as always, I'd like to thank you for the freedom we still have together in your name. Thank you for the evidence you're showing us, all the evidence that's preserved to show us that your word is true and you are who you say you are. Please help us bolster our witnessing to others and be able to share the gospel with those around us. And I pray these things in Jesus' name.